Hello, my name is Professor Rakshit. This is module number 16. It is United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. The topic for today comes under the paper of the International Fora for the Protection, Promotion and Enforcement of Human Rights. Now, the description of module. Basically, it is to be seen that time and again, men and women have been victims of war and persecution. Throughout history, it has been observed that whenever there has been a massive conflict, people have gone and moved to some other land seeking refuge. Whenever there is a crisis as far as famine, earthquake or political persecution. Now, to say this in other words, throughout history, people have fled their homes to escape persecution. In the aftermath of the Second World War, the international community included the right to seek and enjoy asylum in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In 1950, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, was created to protect and assist refugees, and in 1951, the UN adopted the Convention relating to the status of refugees, which is the cornerstone document of refugee protection. In addition, the protocol relating to the status of refugees, the 1967 protocol, helped widen the definition of a refugee, as it lifted the time and geographical limits found in the 1951 convention. While the international community has generally responded swiftly and generously to refugee crisis in the past, some worrying trends are emerging. Now, what are the worrying trends? Countries that once generously opened their doors to refugees have largely regressed in their commitment to protect refugees by adopting adversarial and restrictive policies. Real and perceived abuses of asylum systems as well as irregular movements have led to the refusal of entry to refugees and expulsion from asylum. Those who reach a potential country of asylum are sometimes turned away or sent back without having been able to apply for asylum. The majority of today's refugees are from Africa and Asia. The current refugee movements frequently take the form of mass exoduses rather than individual flights, which we see when we open the channel. 80% are women and children, and the causes of flight now include natural or ecological disasters and extreme poverty. As a result, many of today's refugees do not fit the definition contained in the 1951 convention. The latest figures available show that the number of refugees of concern to UNHCR in mid-2014 stood at 13 million refugees, up from earlier a further 5 million registered refugees are looked after in some 60 camps in the Middle East by the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. This work agency is for Palestinian refugees in the Near East, that is UNRWA, which was set up in 1949 to care for displaced Palestinians. The refugees of concern to UNHCR are spread around the world, with half in Asia and some 28% in Africa. The refugees live in widely varying conditions, from well-established camps and collective centers to very makeshift shelters or living out even in the open in very miserable conditions. The growing number of refugees around the world is overshadowed by the even greater numbers of internally displaced people or IDPs who have not crossed an international border in search of shelter and safety. As of the end of 2014, a record-breaking 38 million people were forcibly displaced within their own country by violence. And this figure rose from 33.3 million for 2013. In mid-2014, the UNHCR was caring for around 26 million of the world IDP population at that time, internally displaced refugees, like refugees that were forcibly displaced by conflict, generalized violence, and human rights violation. UNHCR helps IDPs as a part of a wider intervention by the international community. Finally, UNHCR advocates fair and efficient procedures for asylum seekers. The term asylum seeker and refugees are often confused. An asylum seeker is someone who says he or she is a refugee, but whose claim has not yet been definitely evaluated. That is the difference. On average, about 1 million people seek asylum on an individual basis every year. In mid-2014, there were more than 1.2 million asylum seekers. Learning outcomes? To understand what are the learning outcomes of this? To understand the definition of a refugee, to the covenants guaranteeing its stance, see refugee protection, refugee and UNHCR's work in India. Now, let us understand in legal parlance who is a refugee. According to the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees, a refugee is someone who has a well-founded fear of persecution because of his or her one, race, second, religion, third, nationality, and fourth, membership in a particular group or political opinion, and is outside his or her country of origin and is unable or unwilling to avail himself or herself of the protection of that country, or even return there for fear of persecution. The Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, that is the UNHCR. What is it about? The Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees was established on December 14, 1950 by the United Nations General Assembly to help the estimated 1 million people still uprooted after World War II return home. Since then, the agency has helped find durable solutions for tens of millions of refugees, and they remain its core constituency. The agency is mandated to lead and coordinate international action to protect refugees and resolve refugee-related problems worldwide. Its primary purpose is to safeguard the rights and well-being of refugees. It strives to ensure that everyone can exercise the right to seek asylum and find safe refuge in another state within the option to return home voluntarily. Also, to integrate locally or to resettle in a third country. It also has a mandate to help stateless people and internally displaced people who are known as the IDPs. The UNHCR is led by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. Currently, Antonio Guterres was elected to the post in June 2005 as head of the organization. The High Commissioner is responsible for the direction as well as the control of UNHCR. Amongst his various functions, he directs the work of UNHCR with the assistance of a Deputy High Commissioner and Assistant High Commissioner for protection and operations, overseeing its over 9,300 staff members work in 123 countries, providing protection and assistance to nearly 55 million refugees, returnees, internally displaced people and stateless persons. Some 88% of UNHCR staff work in the field, often in difficult and dangerous duty stations, is also done by the staff of the UNHCR. The organization needs-based budget for 2015 was US $7 billion. UNHCR works on the basis of its statutes and the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees and its 1967 protocol. UNHCR functions include securing legal and practical protection to refugees with and through governments, overseeing the mobilization and coordination of resources for the well-being and survival of refugees. It also strives to encourage conditions in conflict zones that will allow refugees return voluntarily to their respective countries of origin. The 1951 Convention is the key legal document in defining who is a refugee, refugee rights and the legal obligations of states is also an important aspect. The UNHCR also promotes international refugee agreements and monitors government compliance. With international refugee law as such, the UNHCR mandate is, however, very limited. In its supervisory role, for numerous reasons, unlike the international system of human rights protection, there is no formal mechanism in international refugee law to receive individuals or interstate complaints and provisions of the 1951 Refugee Convention, which sets out obligations for states to provide UNHCR with information and data on inter alia the implementation of the convention. The implementation of the convention, gathering from there, has not been given full effect. As a consequence, there is no review of country practices that can be used to aid in ensuring states' compliance with international standards. These standards pertain to refugee protection. To promote accession by states to international agreements relating to refugee and monitoring, governments and compliance with international refugee law, the global consultations on international protection were launched in 2001. The consultations aimed at promoting improved understanding of the 1951 Convention, its strengths, limitations and potential. The process was designed along three tracks: A. Ministerial, that is, meeting of state parties to the convention; B. Roundtable meetings with experts; and C. Policy formulation in the framework of the executive committee, or known as the ExCom. These consultations resulted in the establishment of the Agenda for Protection, which was basically a series of guidelines for UNHCR, governments and humanitarian organizations to strengthen worldwide refugee protection. The ExCom Standing Committee meets several times each year to advise on international protection and discuss a wide range of other issues with UNHCR and its intergovernmental and non-governmental bodies. The ExCom has become the main international forum developing standards of refugee protection. The committee is made up of 76 countries and meets every autumn in Geneva. Their aim is to review and approve the agency's programs and budgets and to advise on protective matters. The ExCom sets international standards with respect to the treatment of refugees and provides a forum for wide-ranging exchanges among governments, the UNHCR and its numerous intergovernmental and non-governmental partners. ExCom Standing Committee meets several times each year to carry on the body's work. Between plenary sessions, the conclusions of this annual intergovernmental meeting represent an important international consensus regarding refugees as well as refugee-related issues, and carry a certain persuasive authority as standards of refugee protection. In this field, the UNHCR staff work to protect refugees through a wide range of activities, including emergency response, relocating refugee camps away from border areas, to improving safety, ensuring the refugee women have access to food distribution and social services. It also aims at reuniting separated families, providing information to refugees on conditions in their home country so that they can make decisions about return. Documenting a refugee's need for resettlement to a third country of asylum. Visiting detention centers and giving advice to governments on draft refugee laws, policies and practices. The UNHCR seeks long-term and durable solutions to refugee problems by helping refugees return voluntarily to their home countries. If the situation allows it, monitoring the treatment and promoting the reintegration of returnees after repatriation has taken place. It also aims to helping refugees integrate in their countries of asylum and resettling refugees to third countries when needed. The UN Convention relating to the status of refugees, the 1951 Refugee Convention, as amended by the 1967 Protocol, is the most important international instrument. It protects the rights of refugees. According to Article 1A of the Convention, A refugee is any person who, owing to well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable, or owing to such fear is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country, or who, not having a nationality and being outside the country of his former habitual residence, she or he is unable, owing to such fear, is unwilling to turn to it. The 1951 Convention specifies who is a refugee and what rights a refugee has. In Article 33, the principle of non-refoulement is establishment. This forbids states to expel or return a refugee in any manner whatsoever to the frontiers of territories where his or her life or freedom would be threatened. An account of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion. The non-refoulement principle also encompasses non-rejection at the border and oblige a state to exempt a person on its territory. It does not oblige a state to grant the person asylum. The refugee may be expelled to another country or another state where his or her freedom will not be in danger or jeopardy, provided that state is prepared to admit him or her. Granting asylum may, however, be the result of non-refoulement if no other state is prepared to admit the refugee. The 1951 Convention also includes exclusion clauses which stem from the understanding that the commission of some types of crimes justifies the exclusion of the perpetrators from the benefits of refugee status. Under Article 1F, refugee status under the 1951 Convention does not apply to persons with regard to whom there are serious reasons for considering they have committed the following offences. These crimes are: A, crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity; B, serious non-political acts; and C, acts contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. Thus, if one of the exclusion clauses applies, the claimant cannot be a convention refugee, whatever the other merits of his or her claim may be. Often the recognition as a refugee on the basis of Article 1A of the 1951 Convention will coincide with the granting of asylum. According to national law, in general, asylum will not be granted if the person concerned can enjoy protection elsewhere, or if there are compelling reasons of public order not to admit him or her. Although the definition of a refugee in Article 1A of the 1951 Convention is formulated in a general way and can therefore be applied broadly, it is limited by the fact that the well-founded fear of persecution must be based on the 5 grounds mentioned in Article 1A. However, there can be situations in which it would be inhumane to return someone who does not fulfill the criteria for refugee status under the Refugee Convention. This can result of general circumstances in the country of origin, such as, for example, war and hunger. It will also be related to individual choices or individual circumstances, such as the risk of torture or cruel or inhuman or degrading treatment. Upon return of the individual to that place, granting of asylum may therefore imply both admissions as refugee on the basis of the 1951 Convention and permission to stay on humanitarian grounds. In addition to the 1951 Convention and the 1967 Protocol, two regional instruments have been adopted, expanding the definition found in the 1951 Convention. Those are the OAU Convention governing the specific aspects of refugee problems in Africa 1969 and the Cartagena Declaration on Refugees in 1984. There is also refugee protection and international human rights, international humanitarian law. In addition to international and regional refugee conventions, international human rights law and international humanitarian law play a significant role in guaranteeing international protection of refugees. Article 7 of International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights ICCPR has been interpreted to prohibit return to situations which the person is in a situation to suffer torture or other cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment. Nearly all of ICCPR's provision apply to both citizens and non-citizens. Article 3 Convention against torture, CAT, provides for protection from refoulement in situations where there is a substantial risk of torture. The non-refoulement provisions under CAT is absolute, unlike the non-refoulement provision of the 1951 Convention. It is not linked to cases where a person fears harm or account of religion, race, nationality, membership to a particular social and a political organization. It does not provide for exceptions based on national security. This means that the prohibition of return applies to all persons regardless of their past criminal conduct. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, or the CRC, applies to all children. This applies without discrimination, including child refugees and asylum seekers. CRC specifically stipulates that every child seeking refugee status has a right to protection and humanitarian assistance in the enjoyment of the rights set forth in the Convention, as well as other conventions to which the state is a party. The International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances sets out non-refoulement where there are substantial grounds for believing that a person would be in danger of being subjected to an enforced disappearance. This is Article 16. Regional human rights instruments also establish important safeguards for refugees. For example, Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights, EHCR, has been interpreted by the European courts to prohibit the return of any person when there is a risk of torture. Well, Article 22(7), which is the American Convention on Human Rights, that is ACHCR, recognizes the right to seek as well as to be granted asylum. And Article 22(8) prohibits refoulement, a prohibition which is formulated in absolute terms. In humanitarian law, Article 44 of the 4th Geneva Convention relates relative to the protection of civilian persons in the time of war, deals specifically with refugees and displaced persons. Moreover, the 1977 additional protocol provides that refugees and stateless persons are to be protected under what is known as the provision of parts 1 and part 3 of the 4th Geneva Convention. Notably, in October 2009, the African Union adopted the Convention for the Protection and Assistance of Interdisplaced Persons in Africa, which was held in Kampala Convention. The first international displacement specific convention covering an entire region. Given the general nature of UNHCR supervisory role, international humanitarian law has an important supervisory mechanism, have also played a significant role in protecting victims, rights of refugees as well as asylum seekers against torture, against forced disappearances, etc., etc. Both the Committee Against Torture and the Human Rights Committee constitute crucial safeguards for refugees as well as asylum seekers in danger of being persecuted or returned to face torture or cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. Under its individual complaint procedure, the Committee Against Torture, for example, has developed a broad jurisprudence concerning the principle of non-committant or non-refoulement under Article 3. The CAT has provided important protection to refugees as well as asylum seekers who risked being deported to countries where they were or in a position to be exposed to torture, other forms of cruel and degrading treatment. And then there is a Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and the CEDAW, CRC and CRD committees have all played an important role in the rights and refugee protection by raising issues relating to refugees. When examining state reports, the European Court has found obligations of parties to the European Conventions relating to refugees, other nationals in a series of judgments on private family life and the right to an effective remedy, and also perhaps most importantly prohibits of return when there is a risk of torture. Similarly, at the international inter-American level, the court and in particular the Commission have looked into and played an important role in the protection of the human rights of refugees and other non-nationals as well. Therefore, in order to conclude, it is important to note that, to summarize, there are only two aspects which have to be kept in mind, that whenever we look into the reports of the Commission, we must also look into refugees and even UNHCR's work in India. We all know that India offers asylum to a number of refugees, Although it is not a signatory of 1951 Refugee Convention, more than 200,000 refugees and asylum seekers of various origins live in India, of whom some 30,000 are registered with the UNHCR. Like many other countries in the region, India has seen a growing number of people seeking asylum in recent years, and UNHCR of the view that this trend is likely to continue. In the absence of national asylum legislation, UNHCR conducts registration and refugee status determination (RSD) and facilitates the resettlement of vulnerable groups. The agency cooperates with the Indian government as well as with NGOs and other organizations to protect, assist and find durable conditions for refugees and other people of concern. Poverty is a key challenge for the majority of refugees and asylum seekers, who may face discrimination from the local communities within whom they are based. Little understanding of the refugee issues. Through partnership with the Indian government, UNHCR aims to enhance asylum space, including by identifying opportunities for local integration, improving livelihoods for urban refugees, ensuring the smooth voluntary return of refugees from India to their respective Sri Lanka and possibly Myanmar. Further identifying other durable solutions for refugees from Bhutan. While the government has adopted various approaches to deal with the refugee population, the UNHCR tries to fill the gaps in terms of protection, assistance and durable solutions. It focuses on the most vulnerable sections, including women, children and elderly survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, and those with special needs. It also advocates adopting national refugee frameworks and accession to international refugee instruments. In summarize, that who is a refugee is basically a person who has run away from his country for the fear of persecution, or is unwilling to come back to his country in order to face torture and persecution. Thank you.